Thanks very much, Julie. And myself and Stephen have the rather straightforward task of thinking about the economics for the next programme for government. There were a couple of ways that we approached it. The first was just thinking about the path. If you had been in charge of managing the Irish economy over the last 25 years, first, what a roller coaster it would have been, and whereabouts in the roller coaster journey are we at the moment? In some sense, we're coming full circle to perhaps 10 or 12 or 15 years ago. The second, and this is something myself and Stephen have been thinking about really actually since the last general election, was what are core principles for how the government spends money, and not based on where we are now, but based on where we might like to be or what best practice might be 20, 30, 50 years into the future, and aligning ourselves now to those principles, or at least thinking about how we might get to those principles. But of course, it would also be remiss to not actually pick out a few key issues over the next 5 years. So we'll finish up by looking at some of the themes that are most important and trying to be as exclusive as possible compared to the other talks that are on today. So this is Ireland's real GDP growth ranked out of all the EU 15 member states from 2000 up to 2020. These are the IMF figures. So it's stripping out inflation. It's looking just at our peer group within the EU 15. I've left Luxembourg in there, but any of the years where there's a star are years where Luxembourg is actually ranking above Ireland. And you can see that up to 2007, Ireland was used to basically being number one, give or take a Luxembourg or two. And then 2008, 9, 10 were the worst years where it was at the bottom of the class. Actually, when you look at Ireland's relative economic performance over the lifetime of this government, if I were in the government, I'd be probably thinking about trying to get this, that performance there, fifth, third, second, and finishing at first. I think that's a very interesting trend that then the expectation is we'll basically keep that up over the next 5 years. That barring Luxembourg and, interestingly enough, Greece, that Ireland is expected to have the highest real GDP growth rate over the lifetime of the next government. So, is this back to the top of the class? Is this sustainable? What are the implications for government spending? Well, one of the phrases that kept coming to our heads when we were planning this was coming full circle. So if you think back to 2002 to 2007, the real challenge for the government at the time was managing expectations in a rapidly growing economy. The major policy error there was a lack of macroprudential policy. So allowing the government and allowing business and allowing households to take on too much debt in a way that threatened financial stability. But this was not something unique to Ireland. It was perhaps something we did more than other states, but it certainly wasn't unique to Ireland. 2007 to 2011, really the economics of the time was about survival. There was an economic crisis that threatened many of the core services that the state provides, particularly to those on lower incomes. The error this time around was socialising existing debt on the part of the financial system. It's not fully agreed, but there's widespread agreement that one of the errors here was guaranteeing all the past debt. Really what you needed to do was guarantee the future debt for a certain period of time and sort out the financial system. And instead they guaranteed absolutely everything from the past. We were perhaps a leader on this, but again we were not alone. Maybe we set a precedent, maybe we were pushed into setting a precedent, and that's a debate for a different day, but lots of other countries made the same mistake in terms of turning financial debt into public debt. 2011 to 2016, the government that we're getting towards the end of now, really that's been about readjusting or continuing the readjustment of public spending. And also restoring economic confidence. The challenge here has been doing it in a way that doesn't undermine the financial or the stability, the financial stability of the state, fiscal stability, but also meeting the expectations of the electorate. So it's unlikely, for example, if you went back to this graph, it's unlikely if you asked most voters where did Ireland rank in terms of economic growth in the lifetime of the government that's just coming to an end. They're unlikely to say pretty much entirely in the top 3 and in fact in the top 5 throughout the lifetime of the government. Very few people know that. And of course the challenge from 2016 on looks like it's going to be how do you manage expectations in a rapidly growing economy? Perhaps not as rapid as it was 2002 to 2007, but that's a good thing because a lot of that growth was credit fueled. But it is going to be one of the fastest growing developed countries in the world over the next 5 years. That's the expectation currently. So very much coming full circle, and whoever is in power after the next election, it's unlikely to be a Fianna Fáil PD coalition, I think we can say, but whatever combination it is going to have a set of challenges that the managers who maybe do have experience on the public sector side, they'll be perhaps quite familiar with. Just to give you a quick idea of the bubbles are the size of the fiscal adjustment. These are legacy issues that Ireland didn't have in 2002 to 2007. These are the various fiscal adjustments that Ireland undertook between 2008 and 2013. And then sort of in the background you can see the year-on-year change in GDP and in employment. So in particular 2008, 9, 10 into 2011, you can see the economy shrinking. And at the same time a cumulative fiscal adjustment of between 25 and 30 billion euro, which is huge. As a result of that, what we have is a system, a tax system, a revenue system, which is largely dominated by income tax and VAT. So if you look, say, 2006, 2007, income tax and VAT were less than or roughly 60% of all government revenues. Now it's close to 70%. And of course, key part of that was a fall off in what turned out to be, and what were probably predictably, temporary revenues. Roughly speaking, at least 10 billion of government revenues as of 2006 came from the construction, from income tax from the excess of construction workers, from VAT receipts relating to excess construction, and of course from stamp duty and capital gains tax and other property related taxes, and they have fallen off considerably by about 6.5 billion. So of the 10 in a state where spending has fallen by about 10 billion, revenues from property have fallen by about 6.5 billion. So a lot of the austerity is ultimately in some way related to the over-reliance on housing. And the problem with a system that's so heavily skewed towards VAT and income tax is that income tax, particularly the marginal rate on someone earning at least the average industrial wage, is very damaging for competitiveness. So it's quite tough to make the case to a senior manager working in sort of the globally mobile FDI sector. You should come to Dublin. You should come to Ireland because of the personal taxes. You're never going to make that case. You've got to make the case through some other attractive elements of the Dublin package or the Ireland package. But perhaps more serious than that, particularly for local conditions, is that VAT rate is so regressive. So this is an estimate of the all-in tax rate based on work done by the ESRI, not just counting income tax, USC and PRSI, but also counting VAT as well as unavoidable taxes. Sometimes you'll see this chart with excise duties added in. Arguably they're avoidable because you don't have to smoke, you don't have to drink. But VAT is unavoidable, particularly if you're on lower incomes. And you can see that we have once you account it for VAT, a very regressive system, where those the poorest 10% of households pay a higher percentage tax rate all in than those in the middle. Certainly those in fourth and fifth deciles, if not above that. And again, if you showed this chart to people and said it's clear that those who are in the wealthiest 20% pay significantly higher, not just in levels but in percentages, again, I think you'd meet with a few raised eyebrows. That's not widely known that we are quite dependent in terms of the aggregate of revenues on the wealthiest 10 to 20% of households. That's that's a concern on the revenue side. A concern on the spending side is that we're actually borrowing still, despite an expansionary government. We're borrowing still, and we're borrowing for current spending, not capital spending. I'm a lot less obsessed about primary surpluses and deficits than a lot of economists. I just don't think that you can exclude the interest on your national debt in any way that meaningfully makes sense. Britain is still paying for the Anglo-Dutch wars, sure, but it has a much bigger economy now, and therefore the burden of those wars is tiny. What's much more important is, are you investing to increase the size of the future economy? In other words, if you're borrowing in a way that's going to generate revenues that pay back what you're borrowing, then I'd be a lot less worried than if you're borrowing just to keep the state ticking over. And the dashed black line there is probably, on the left-hand side, is probably the easiest one to look at. It's the fraction of all voted spending that's on capital spending, as opposed to current spending. And you can see from the 80s and again into the 2000s, between 15 and 20% of all voted spending was basically to make future economic growth, or the future economy, bigger. Now we're below 10%. And this is just a post-2007, indeed a post-2010 feature. Anything that's capital spending can get cut because our children, who aren't going to enjoy these things until they're fully grown, can't complain as loudly as current recipients can. And that's not unique to Ireland, but it is something we need to be aware of. And this trend is somewhat unique to Ireland. And the right-hand side just shows you the balances on current spending and capital spending for the economy as a whole. And you can see capital spending there is basically back to balance, which you don't necessarily want if you think your economy is growing. Meanwhile, current spending is running a significant deficit. So they're coming full circle, but with a very different set of circumstances in terms of the revenue base and the spending base compared to, say, the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. In terms of guidelines for public spending, this is the sort of the science bit. Fiscal is the new monetary. If you think about how local economies responded to shocks in the past, whether they're domestic or international, in the good old days of the 20s and 30s, they responded with trade policy. And indeed before that was the first thing you did, was cut off cheaper foreign competition and you stimulate domestic industry. Thankfully, that's a bit beggar thy neighbour. So thankfully we don't have that easy option anymore. We're trying to come up with more sustainable solutions. But it does take away that overnight solution, and monetary policy is not an option anymore either. At least not peculiar to Ireland, because we're basically the equivalent of Delaware within the US. If Delaware receives some sort of negative shock, it's unlikely the US Fed is going to change its interest rate because there's higher unemployment in Delaware. They'll see the solution to that problem somewhere else, in particular through perhaps fiscal transfers at the federal level, but also migration, that people will move out until everything balances out. So fiscal policy is the last man standing, but the problem with fiscal policy is the economists have thought of this for far too long as some sort of black box. The William Petty example was, you could always hire the government to move Stonehenge from one field to the next field over, and then the government hires the same people to move it back. And this would get those people gainfully employed. But, gainfully employed or employed, what's the point if you're just spending money to do something that delivers no social return? So myself and Stephen believe strongly that we need to think about the social return on money spent by the state. So you can think about this concept, social return on investment, and suppose you had 20 lines of government spending, and we got social scientists and policy analysts to figure out what's the lower bound to our estimate of what the social return on these forms of spending is. Then you think about, which deliver the highest return? They should be delivered regardless. Which deliver the lowest return? They should only be delivered when the economy needs a stimulus. So fiscal is not just the new monetary because it's the last man standing, but actually because you can rethink fiscal policy as monetary policy, where you've got something like a central bank that says, in the current economy, we need stimulus, so we're going to lower the threshold rate of social spending, and social return on investment, and that brings the marginal projects that the state was considering into the fold. If the economy is overheating, you do the opposite. You say only projects with a certain higher return on investment, social return on investment, only they can be funded. And that might sound a little bit abstract, but think about it in how the government currently thinks about spending. The government is currently doing spending as an accountant might. However much we spend costs X, and therefore we think of this policy as X. Whatever that number is, that's what the policy is. So, look, we've cut the caregivers allowance, and therefore we've saved the taxpayer €100 million. Of course, we all know, and certainly the Caregivers Association would point out, you haven't saved any money. you've just hidden the costs, at least on the state's accounts. And what you've actually done is push the cost somewhere else. So either you're requiring caregivers to do the same for less, or you are perhaps pushing the people that they were looking after into the public health system, and you just see the costs coming around another way. So we need to move to a more economic approach, cost and benefits rather than just costs, when we think about how the government spends money. That's the first principle, costs and benefits, not just costs. And the second principle is how you raise money should be connected to how it's spent. And this ties in, I think, quite well with the previous paper in terms of local government. One of the striking facts of Irish local government is how few local authorities we have compared to pretty much every other country in Europe on a per million of population basis. And one of the reasons I think for that is because they're really just spending vehicles. They don't make decisions about how much tax are we going to take in this year, what are we going to spend it on in terms of road infrastructure or rail infrastructure or water infrastructure or waste infrastructure, whatever it might be, or indeed social transfers at the local authority level. They're just really vehicles for state level spending. So if we can connect how the money is raised and how it's spent, that will obviously make things that bit easier in terms of thinking about returns, benefits as well as costs. The final bit, to go through a few areas, it will start very much at that social return of investment way of thinking and drift out into other areas, but where the same principles apply. And this is not supposed to be an exhaustive list of the top priorities, but it is supposed to highlight, I think, some of the areas that will form the key of the next programme for government, at least in terms of its economic dimension. So the first one is infrastructure. So on the right-hand side is a graph from work in progress research that I'm doing, which looks at the impact of the Lewis, the Cherrywood Lewis extension on the value of property nearby. And one of the most obvious ways you can link money raised and money spent is through property taxation, because if there's geographic benefits, it will show up in the value of housing, in particular the value of land. So really what you should be thinking about here is some sort of land tax as a way of streamlining all the various forms of real estate revenues across commercial, residential and other. But you can see that there's a huge positive impact on private wealth of public decisions. And until you link those private wealth and public decisions by taking some fraction for the state, how could you ever make the case for spending more on extending the Lewis somewhere else? Because you're not going to actually connect up the money you've spent with the extra private wealth you've created. And the same with motorways and bypasses and other forms of rail. Major infrastructure delivers economic benefit that we can measure, not just in vague terms, like, I say vague, but not just in broad terms, like employment numbers and therefore in income tax receipts, but it's specifically, we can measure the local impact of this. And it's not beyond modern social science to do that. The problem is the modern public service, and this goes back to the first talk, is not thinking about how to bring in that expertise, about connecting benefits and costs. Very much connected with this is housing, and I'd happily spend the rest of the day, keep you until 6 in the evening talking about housing. To give you an idea of the scale of the challenge, just in Dublin we need about 100,000 new homes between 2010 and 2020. We're halfway through the decade, we have 10,000. Is it any wonder we're seeing people falling through the cracks of the housing sector, in particular the private rental market, if we are so far behind just keeping up in terms of housing, let alone providing additional choice above and beyond those 100,000? Why so little supply, new homes being delivered? Well, it's a little known fact, and it's an imprecisely estimated fact. I think it needs to be much better estimated than my sort of back of the envelope stuff. Is that the cost of building the minimum socially acceptable family home rose by at least a third in the 5 years to 2014. This is at a time when the value fell by a little bit longer period, but fell by about 50%. So if you've costs going up so fast at a time when the value, the rent or the house price in particular, and a lot of those cost increases were driven by higher minimum standards. I presented to local authority planners around this time last year in Dublin, and ask them, have they ever done any impact assessment on their new standards on break-even rents? If you increase the size of a minimum one bed by about 40%, which they did, what impact does that have on the break-even cost of building the minimum socially acceptable one bed? And they didn't even know you could do that. It seems to be obvious that your benchmark might be around 40% if you've increased the size by 40%. And you can argue as 30 or 50 or whatever. They thought it was zero. And by doing that, they've effectively discriminated against lower income households. If you look at what's being built at the moment, apartments in particular are only being built in Dublin 2 and Dublin 4. If you're on anything less than the top 15-20% of incomes, you can make do with second-hand housing. We're not allowing any new housing to be built for you. I think that's a very dangerous place to be in, particularly given we have a complete failing in social housing. We don't have any connection, again, between money raised and money spent. So the short-term priority here has to be a breakdown of these construction costs, an official one that the government can't weasel out of by saying, well, that's some vested interest. Benchmark to Northern Ireland in particular, but also many of our other peers. And that will establish an action plan over the next 18 months. In the medium term, we need to overhaul the social housing system so that it's based on income-varying subsidies rather than fixed rent supplements. In the longer term, we need to get the land market working again. It's completely broken. NAMA doesn't help, but it was broken before. In terms of competitiveness, I mean, this is an area where Ireland performs well in policy terms as a general rule. I'd be worried that over the next 10 years, our strongest advantage is path dependence, that it's actually reasonably tough to move clusters of skilled labour around. And therefore that when, if there are unseen consequences of the BEPS project, this is the OECD project to standardise corporate taxation and corporate income reporting, that actually our biggest strength is going to be the fact that we have a lot of this stuff here anyway, and it's reasonably tough to move skilled labour around. Obviously, Brexit is a potential wildcard here. It swings. At some point, this is the worst thing that could ever happen to Ireland, and sometimes it's the best thing that could ever happen. But I think we need to understand the threats if it does happen, and it's looking like 50-50 at the moment that it might. But also a bigger shift in the nature of FDI projects, away from big landmark manufacturing projects that hire 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people, to smaller services-based, higher risk. Some of them are going to be 20, some of them are going to be 20 and grow to 200 or maybe 2,000. But the cost base of those is completely different. It's all based around labour costs, and the single biggest wage demand relates to housing. It's the single biggest spending on the part of workers. So housing and competitiveness are intricately linked. And competitiveness obviously is a vehicle for job creation. Local enterprise and long-term unemployment are going to be key challenges here. I think active labour market policies our understanding of what works in terms of best practice, getting people out of unemployment globally has changed fundamentally over the last 10 years. Roughly speaking, there's now agreement that short-term search and match help works. It's not very cost-effective, but it works. But what really works over the medium to long term is training, these private sector subsidies or indeed direct public sector employment, moving Stonehenge around. These deliver really bad returns to the taxpayer. So you can see the trend on long-term unemployment is going in the right direction, but and that's by age group. You can see there are some problem areas there, 25 to 44 in particular. It's going in the right direction, but it's still very high, even compared to 2009. And in terms of Enterprise Ireland, there's such a focus on unicorns. We're going to find these billion-dollar companies. And that's not what the Denmarks and Swedens of this world have. They have solid mid-tier business. And recognising the contribution of a solid mid-tier business with 20, 50, 100 employees, rather than going after these unicorns, I think that's a change in mindset. And similarly, in the tax code, the entrepreneur is a pariah. Up until this year, and I forget the details in the budget, but the special tax rate in USC, just if you ran your own business, it didn't matter if you earned 20,000 a year or 40,000 a year, and somebody in the public sector earned 200,000 a year. Because you're an entrepreneur, we're going to tax you more. That just seems completely backwards in terms of needing a shift in mindset. The last two areas are healthcare and education as two areas that form the biggest chunk of direct spending on goods and services. And the problem with healthcare is not too few nurses. If anything, it's too many. Again, you won't see that written down in many places. Maybe Colin McCarthy might write it down. That's about it. And we've non-existent capital spending, and there's a lack of willingness to spend capital in healthcare because of PPARs and past problems. But this is a problem that we can look at other countries and learn from. We're a little bit behind the curve on migration, and we're a little bit behind the curve on aging. So over the next even 5 years, you can see, and this is the most optimistic estimate of population change, is that we're going to lose, and I know Dan's going to build on this point, we're going to lose the 20 and 30 somethings, and we're going to gain a lot of 40, 50, and in particular 60, 70 and 80 somethings. So this is not something that's going away. And we are so far behind best practice, again, about organisational culture in terms of patient-centred services and the patient owning the records and the HSE or whoever being custodian of those. And the last one is education. And we focused here on pre-primary because it goes back to the core idea of social return on investment. It is undeniable when you look at all the empirical research that by far the highest social return on investment is pre-primary education. Much as I would love for it to be funding of third level social sciences and economics in particular, it is not. It's pre-primary education, not childcare, pre-primary education that delivers the highest social return on investment. And perhaps the most important reason for that is if you take children at age 5 and look at the circumstances there, you can basically predict reasonably accurately where they're going to be at 18 and 45. Most of the inequality we give out about is built in by age 5. So until we address spending on pre-primary education in particular, we're not going to tackle that much bigger Piketty level issue of inequality. So that was a sort of whistle-stop tour of some of the areas, and I'm not sure if we've time for a Q&A now or we will hold it back for the panel discussion, but I'll ditch all the tough questions on Stephen in the panel discussion if that's the case. Thanks very much.